Welcome everyone to the National Conference of State Legislators Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee 2022 Spring Webinar Series. My name is Aaron Ray. I'm Associate Director for Energy at NCSL. We'll get started in just a few minutes as folks have logged on. As you're signing on, I encourage you to enter your state in the chat box so we know from where you are joining. As folks are signing on, I'll remind you that NCSL's NRI webinar series has additional webinars coming up over the course of the next few weeks on a variety of topics, including microgrids, state efforts to protect vulnerable road users, school bus electrification, and the benefits of wildlife infrastructure. For a complete schedule and registration details, please visit our website at ncsl.org. And it looks like we've got a great turnout in the chat here. Folks from New Mexico, Kansas, California, Kentucky, DC. So a good representation of the states. Thanks everyone for joining us. We'll get started in just a minute. Also looks like we have a number of members of our task force on energy supply. We appreciate those state legislators and staff joining us today. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today at NCSL's webinar, Orphaned No More, Federal Oil and Gas Well Reclamation. My name is Aaron Ray, Associate Director for Energy at NCSL, and I'll be your moderator for today. This is the first webinar in the National Conference of State Legislatures Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee 2022 Spring Webinar Series. We have a total of 5 webinars lined up over the course of the next few weeks on a variety of topics, including microgrids and state and utility efforts to enhance energy resilience, state efforts to protect vulnerable road users, school bus electrification and state policy options, and the benefits of wildlife infrastructure. For a complete schedule and registration details, please visit our website at www.ncsl.org. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to review a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is a platform for information exchange and engagement. Over the next 60 minutes, we encourage participation through our chat, so feel free to type your questions in the chat box or Q&A on your screen. We will hold a Q&A with our panel after the presentations have finished. We encourage you to ask questions in the chat if possible, so we can keep track and ensure that we answer as many of them as possible. When you enter questions in the chat, please note which speaker you would like your question directed to, if it's directed to a particular speaker. Our webinar today is being recorded, and registrants will be able to access a recording of the webinar and presentation slides on NCSL's website. We'll send out a notice once those resources are made available. Now let's get back to why we are here today. States across the country face a backlog of orphaned oil and gas wells, which can continue to emit methane and other pollutants if left unaddressed. However, the cost of sealing and reclaiming oil and gas well sites often exceeds the funds available. Recognizing these challenges, Congress included $4.7 billion for orphaned well reclamation in the federal infrastructure bill, including over $1 billion for states and tribes. This webinar will educate attendees on this new program, how their states can obtain funding, and how to use these funds to meet their state's needs and reclamation priorities. Joining us today are Sarah Solomon, Senior Program Associate for the AAAS Center for Scientific Evidence in Public Issues, Steve Felkus, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals Management at the U.S. Department of the Interior, and Dave Andrews, Orphaned Well Program Manager at the Colorado Department of Natural Resources Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. First up, we have Sarah Solomon. Sarah is a senior program associate at the American Association for the Advancement of Science's Center for Scientific Evidence in Public Issues. Previously, Sarah served as a contractor in the US EPA's Office of Research and Development. She was a member of the author team for the 2016 report, Hydraulic Fracturing for Oil and Gas, Impacts from the Hydraulic Fracturing Water Cycle on Drinking Water Resources in the United States, which was awarded EPA's Gold Medal for exceptional service. Her prior work includes policy-related research on climate change, water quality and monitoring, and environmental education and justice. Sarah graduated from Tufts University with a BS in geology and received her master's degree in environmental sciences and policy with distinction from Johns Hopkins University. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is now yours.
Great, thank you so much. Hi all, thank you to NCSL for having me today and to my fellow presenters. It's an honor to be here with you. My name is Sarah Solomon. I work for the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences Center for Scientific Evidence and Public Issues, which is a mouthful, so we are known as the AAAS Epicenter. We're a nonpartisan, multidisciplinary scientific membership organization based in DC. Many of you may know us simply as AAAS, the publisher of the science family of journals. Next slide, please. The Epicenter is a relatively new initiative at AAAS. Our mission is to deliver clear, concise, and actionable scientific evidence to decision makers. We make it easier for decision makers to access and understand the body of scientific evidence relevant to policies under consideration. We do not make policy recommendations, but rather promote the use of science in decision making. Next slide, please. I'm here today to provide an introduction to the issue of orphan wells. So first off, what's an orphan well? And as you'll hear, definitions vary across jurisdictions, but an orphan well is generally considered to be any oil or gas well without a solvent, legally responsible party to conduct proper plugging and site restoration. These wells become the responsibility of a state, tribe, or the federal government, depending on where they're located. Why is it important to distinguish between an orphan well and an abandoned well? You might ask. Well, abandonment is an industry process. A well is taken out of production and permanently closed and sealed according to safety and environmental standards. An abandoned well has been closed properly according to industry, and although the connotations of calling something abandoned might be confusing for those who are not in industry, it means something worth recognizing in this context. So how did we end up with so many of these wells? In the US, oil and gas exploration and production have taken place since the mid-1800s, and a history of putting holes in the ground before regulation and best practices means that many wells were left without being properly closed and sealed. Many undocumented orphan wells are pre-regulatory and do not appear on any maps. These are the wells that people might find in their backyards or stumble across in the woods, for example. There are also modern orphan wells. Their former owners and or operators cannot afford to close them, or they simply no longer exist. Market trends and the price of oil and gas often control how many of these wells become the responsibility of the state and are already in state portfolios. How many more of these regulators can expect to manage in the future? Why are these wells, whatever we call them, problematic? It's simple, really. Unplugged wells can leak harmful substances to the air, water, and soil, especially if they're old and built before modern safety or integrity standards, or if they are in poor condition. It's important to remember that in addition to identifying what might come out of these wells, either as a fluid or airborne, and the associated environmental and human health effects, there are also significant economic impacts. These wells are costly to plug, ranging from thousands of dollars to millions of dollars per well. So we're looking at a total cost of billions of dollars potentially. And that burden falls on states state and federal land managers, regulators, or in tribal or indigenous authorities, again, depending on where the well's located. So concern over environmental, public health, and economic impacts have prompted Congress, federal agencies, and state agencies to explore and adopt policy to address orphan wells and their potential impacts. I'll go into more detail on that later. Next slide, please. This slide is all about sort of getting a handle on the scale of the problem. And this question of scale determines, what states are doing, how they're going to respond. Big questions like, where are these wells? How many are there exactly? And different groups have estimated a range from tens of thousands to millions of orphan wells. These, again, are definition dependent, documentation dependent. So on screen here is a map released by the Environmental Defense Fund in 2021, which was created in collaboration with researchers from McGill University. They developed, using state-provided data, this map of documented orphan wells in the contiguous United States to visualize the distribution and densities of wells eligible for closure funding under the REGRO Act, which was proposed by Senators Ben Ray Lujan of New Mexico and Kevin Kramer of North Dakota, many of whose provisions ended up making it into the IIJA. So on screen right now, we're looking at approximately 81,000 documented orphan wells across 28 states, and this is as of summer 2021. The Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission's 2021 report has self-reported numbers from states as well. The 32 states that participated in their survey reported a total of 92,198 documented orphan wells, and their count ran through December 31st, 2020. This number, over 92,000, represents a 50% increase since the survey was last conducted in 2018, largely due to state efforts to complete their inventories. And of the states surveyed, so of those 32 states, 15 provided estimates of undocumented orphan wells that they believe are out there, for an additional total anywhere between 310,000 to 800,000. So just as a quick comparison, states had until December 30th, 2021 to notify the Department of Interior of their interest in applying for a formula grant, which my peers on this webinar will go into much more detail on. So this NOI, or Notice of Intent process, to the Department of Interior cumulatively indicated that there are over 130,000 documented orphan wells in the 26 states that submitted notices of intent. So as I said, it's costly to plug and abandon an orphan well, and doing some, back of the envelope calculation based on these numbers, we're starting to look at a burden of billions of dollars. Right now, many states are modernizing their databases and confirming the location and legal status of suspected orphan wells. And we're thinking that numbers are going to keep fluctuating. We also want to be cognizant that there are a large number of idle or active but low or non-producing wells that might transition into the orphan category in the future. And states are concerned about this. Next slide, please. So on screen, I just have a few questions that regulators, decision makers, stakeholders, researchers, and others are asking about orphan and abandoned wells and related issues. And these questions really inform our understanding of the problem and the solutions that we can come to and collaborate on. So I'm going to just run past these really quick, get to the meat and potatoes. So next slide, please. So over the last 10 years, states have made considerable progress in developing their own unique orphan well programs and managing and plugging these wells that they know about, that they already are responsible for. State programs reside in different agencies with unique purview. So some fall under energy, environment, health, and all of these programs are continuing to evaluate and adjust their standards, plugging requirements, inspection enforcement procedures, financial assurance requirements, plugging fund, all of these provisions to reduce the likelihood of additional wells becoming orphaned and becoming their responsibility. They're also looking to make sure that they have the resources available for well plugging and site restoration. So these programs consist of a lot of different interconnected elements that together ensure wells are properly plugged at the end of their productive lives. And this includes monitoring and maintenance, financial assurance, different, plethora of sources for plugging. I think, the big question often is around financial assurance. And most states require some form of financial assurance to provide money for plugging and restoration if the operator defaults. The types of financial assurance vary considerably depending on the state. So some have a single well fee, some have blanket coverage, some have a combination of both. The amount of assurance that is put down depends, again, on the state, whether it's uniform for all wells or whether the conditions, depth, location, type, status are determined on a case-by-case basis. In addition to financial assurance, some states have funds dedicated to plugging orphan wells. Money for those funds comes primarily from taxes, fees, or other assessments on the oil and gas industry. So in the 2021 IOGCC report, which I refer to a lot, most participating states reported on innovations, changes, updates, advancements in their programs. Many added staff, they improved their data management systems, they streamlined their contract management process, which is very important for actually getting the wells plugged. States are also, as I said, reviewing and updating their portfolios to try and get a true handle on how many wells they are going to be or already responsible for, and thinking about which wells are priorities for plugging. Are they high risk? And what are the conditions that make a well high risk? So in addition to that, states are using GIS, geographic information systems, and drone technologies, part of that effort to determine the condition of a well, the location of a well, to find orphan well sites. They're also collaborating with operators, researchers, landowners to address these associated problems in a lot of very unique ways, using grant programs, economic stimulus funds, third-party partnerships, you name it. So obviously there's been a lot of great progress in the last decade, but there is still concern over the potential for these portfolios to grow, and market conditions affect that. Next slide, please. So as I said, over the last 2 years, Congress, federal agencies, state agencies have been engaged in this conversation and have been exploring and adopting policies to address orphan wells and their potential impacts. This slide just sort of lays out very bare bones, much abbreviated history of how we got here. The initial idea for using federal COVID-19 stimulus funds to employ workers to clean up orphan wells really sort of floated to the top in 2020 and has since taken many forms. But the legislative language and outline of the program developed in 2020 and sort of became the basis, what was eventually included in the IIJA. So very specifically, Section 40601 of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, Public Law 11758, makes $4.7 billion available over the next 9 years for plugging orphan oil and gas wells and remediating and restoring well sites on federal lands, tribal lands, state-owned lands, and privately owned lands. The Department of Interior, who are here with us on the call today, are the lead implementing agency, and I'm sure they will go into much, much more detail during their presentation. So next slide, that's all I have for you today. I'm happy to take any questions at the end, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was a terrific overview. And I'll remind our attendees that if you have questions for Sarah, please add them to the chat and we'll answer those at the end of the presentations. I'll also note that Sarah mentioned state financial assistance, financial assurance mechanisms. NCSL's energy program maintains a catalog of state requirements, and my colleague Austin Ickelhart, who leads NCL's work on oil and gas issues, has provided a link to that resource in the chat. Next up, we have Steve Felgus. Steve is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals Management at the Department of the Interior. Prior to joining DOI, he was the Deputy Staff Director for the House Natural Resources Committee and has worked for the Bureau of Land Management, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, and has held various other positions during 16 years working for Congress. Steve holds a Bachelor of Science from the University of Massachusetts and a PhD in Chemistry from the University of Wisconsin. Steve, thank you very much for joining us today, and the floor is now yours.
Aaron, thank you very much. And thank you, Sarah, to a great overview presentation about orphan wells. Makes this a lot easier to jump right in and start talking. First of all, I want to thank everyone for the invitation to speak to you today. The states are, it's hard to overstate how much of a partner the states are in our implementation of this program. We've been working very closely with the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission and individual states, even going before the infrastructure bill was signed. So there have been initial discussions, and since then those discussions have gotten more regular. And I will go over some of the places where states have already weighed in, and we're not done accepting feedback. So as you listen to this, if you have questions, you have comments, you have issues with how we're implementing this, please let us know. Next slide, please. So as Sarah mentioned, the overall structure of the orphan well plugging program in the bipartisan infrastructure law was a little over 4.7 billion, split into three main buckets. The first is the federal oil and gas program, $250 million, and that's for plugging orphan wells on federal land. So either DOI managed land or Forest Service managed land. That is one thing that I won't be talking too much about here. The one in the middle is the one, of course, that I imagine most people here are the most interested in. That's the nearly $4.3 billion available through a variety of state grants. And then there's also a separate grant program, $150 million for tribal nations. And then there were a few additional authorizations in the bill, $30 million to the Department of Energy, primarily to help detect undocumented orphan wells, because as Sarah mentioned, there are a lot of them out there. We know how many of the states have reported in documented wells. It's close to 130,000. But as she said, and as we are aware, there are likely hundreds of thousands of more wells out there that we just have not found yet. So DOE's $30 million is going to go to research towards trying to figure out better methods for detecting those. And then also $2 million for the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission to help with the coordination role, and also assistance working with the states, and really emphasizes that even in legislation, the states really are designed to be a partner in this program, and that's the way that we're treating them. So next slide, please. So here is how the state's grant program is split out. It is three different grant programs or grant methods. The first is the initial grants, which is $775 million in total. And that is, I'll put in a little more detail in a second, but we're very close to putting out final guidance on that right there. Then the formula grants for $2 billion, that is going to go out according to a formula that I'll describe in a little more detail in a later slide, but this would be generally the second available set of money for states. And then performance grants is $1.5 billion. And this one states can apply for until 6 months after they receive their initial grants, and no states have received initial grants yet. So this one is still a little bit further down the line. So we still have more work to do setting that one up. But on the left here, I've just indicated the different allowable uses for this money once it goes to the states, and it's very broad. It's of course for plugging the orphan wells themselves, but also for cleaning up the areas around the wells, finding new wells, tracking methane, finding and tracking water contamination, providing info to the general public. There's an allowable use for administrative costs, and so on. So it's pretty flexible in terms of what states are able to use this money for. Next slide, please. Okay. So here is the timeline for the initial state grants. And as I mentioned, this is the $775 million that's available almost immediately, very shortly. States can request one of two types of grants, either what we're calling a large scale grant of up to $25 million, or a small scale grant of up to $5 million. And the $5 million grant comes with fewer requirements in terms of the application and also reporting. The $25 million grants do not have a ton of requirements, but they do have more reporting built in and a few other little differences. So this timeline, unfortunately, the font got a little bit messed up, so apologies for that. But you can see sort of where we are with that gray star. We are right about to issue the final guidance for these grants. The draft went out a few weeks ago. We held that open for 2 weeks for comments. We held a couple of public webinars, and we received comments from about a dozen states, and we've been incorporating a lot of those into the draft guidance. And when we roll out the final, it will look fairly similar to the draft, but a number of changes that were requested. One of the reasons we need to get this out very shortly is there is an application deadline established by the legislation of May 14th, 2022 for states to apply for that $25 million grant. If a state only wants up to $5 million, then there's no application deadline. They can just, up until the funds are no longer available for obligation, which is in 2030. So the official legislative deadline is May 14th. That falls on a Saturday. So we're requesting applications be in by midnight on May 13th. Once the application is complete, then we have 30 days to disperse the funds to the state, although there's a little bit of flexibility as to when states actually draw those funds down. I don't want to get into too many details, but I'll just say that once we award the money, it doesn't necessarily go right into the state hands if they don't want it, because there are some deadlines in the legislation. For example, this 1-year deadline for obligating the grant money. And anything that has not been obligated after 1 year would then get returned to the Department of the Interior. So if a state isn't quite ready to get those contracts going, there's also a certification states have to make that they will spend 90% of this money within 90 days, or at least enter into contracts for 90% of this money within 90 days. We're trying to provide as much flexibility as possible so states don't have to start immediately once they get the award. And then after the 1 year period is over, then there's 3 months and a reporting deadline for states to report on how they use this money. Next slide, please. So in the draft guidance for the initial grants that we put out, as I mentioned, there is not a ton of required elements. That's the way the legislation was written. It was largely states make a certain set of certifications, and then obviously having to meet some standard federal grant guidelines. But then that money is provided with a very limited number of requirements, reporting requirements, the 1 year requirement, 90% certification. Otherwise, states are basically able to use this money, simply plug that into their existing programs. However, we do include in the guidance a set of recommended practices that we are encouraging states to include in their programs as they get this additional money, if they don't already have them in there. And these include things like working out a detailed prioritization process that includes proximity to population, impacts on tribes or disadvantaged communities, several other things that are laid out in the legislation. Methane measurement, making sure to take detailed measurements of methane before the well is plugged and then after the well is plugged, and then also standards on site plugging and site remediation and so on. For the initial grants, as I said, these are not required elements, but some of these may be required for using the later grant money. So we are certainly encouraging states to build this into their program, not only to make them best practices that will ensure that this money is being spent properly and that we're measuring methane impacts and population impacts, but also that if these become requirements in later grants, states are already prepared to hit the ground running with the new money. And of course, a very big one at the bottom there is coordination with the federal government and tribes, because the most efficient way to close a lot of these wells is to enter into contracts that make geographic sense. That is not having a state contract separate from a federal contract when the two wells or the two sets of wells are right next door. So we're very much encouraging the states to reach out to the federal government to see where the local federal wells are or local tribal wells are, so that these can be all encompassed in one more efficient contract And in the final guidance, we're going to have some more detailed directions on how to contact the federal government to make that process happen. Next slide, please. So here is the timeline for the state formula grants. Ironically, even though the initial grants are the first money that are going to go out, the formula grants had the first deadlines in the bill. And as Sarah mentioned, this was December 31st, 2021, actually December 30th. Sorry, states needed to notify us if they intended to apply for a formula grant. And we did get notifications from 26 states. And now that is into our formula that I'm going to show in another slide or so, which we published in late January. But now we are sort of in between that publication and when state applications would come in. Before states can apply, we're going to issue guidance on this program as well, because as I mentioned, there may be some slight differences between this and the initial grant application. This will also be first something that we are continuing to work with the states in finalizing the language for, well, not even finalizing, in getting the language ready to go public. Then when it goes public, it will be put out in draft form, again, for more comment, more public input, and also more state feedback. At the time that a state applies, which there is no deadline for, they can apply at any time once the guidance is out. They then have, we have 60 days after receiving a complete application to send the money out, and then states have 5 years to obligate that money. Next slide, please. So here is the formula amounts that we published on January 31st. And I apologize that this is very small print, but this gives a sense of the 26 states that had notified us that they intended to apply for a formula grant, and what we called the phase 1 eligibility, which was the initial grant, so up to $25 million, and then also 1/4 of the total formula funding, so $500 million, how that would be broken down based on the data that we had so far. And the reason we did it this way is because when we received data in late December, first of all, a lot of this data was very estimated, especially when it comes to costs to reclaim wells and the job loss numbers. This was a requirement in the legislation that we consider job losses. You know, by December 2021, the job loss numbers for November of 2021 were not very good. So that's very estimated numbers. Those keep getting improved. The estimated costs are getting improved. And also some states have gone out there and done much more extensive inventories of their orphan wells. Other states have not. And we wanted to make sure that states had time to use some of their initial funding to go out there to find more of the wells they might not have found yet. And then we can factor this better data into how we distribute the remaining $1.5 billion under this formula. And I believe that, oh no, I think I have one more slide here. So next slide, please. So then just to briefly mention the performance grants and the tribal grants, these are moving on a separate track from the initial and formula grants. The performance grants actually break down into 2 different sets. There are regulatory improvement grants designed to incentivize additional methane capture regulations or better bonding requirements. You know, this is written out in the legislation. And then there are matching grants designed to match additional funding that states provide for orphan well activities. And then the tribal grants can either go directly to tribes or can be, the tribe can request that the federal government do the plugging on their behalf on their lands. So that was kind of a whirlwind, tour of the federal options here. I think with that, I will hand it back to Aaron, and then I will be happy to answer any questions when we get to that point.
Thank you, Steve. That was incredibly helpful. It's a complicated set of programs, and we appreciate you talking us through all the details, and we can have some more conversation about these various pieces at the end. Finally, we have Dave Andrews. Dave is responsible for managing the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission's Orphaned Well program. Dave joined COGCC in 2006, where he has served as a staff engineer, an engineering supervisor, and the engineering manager. Prior to joining COGCC, Dave had 12 years experience performing geotechnical and environmental site investigations and design, installation, operation, and maintenance of soil and groundwater remediation systems. He also has degrees in applied engineering, geological engineering, and civil engineering, and he has certificates in oil and gas production and electrical instrumentation. Finally, Dave is a licensed professional engineer in multiple states and a licensed professional geologist. So we're very happy to have Dave joining us today, bringing his expertise to this issue. Dave, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Aaron, for the introduction, and thank you all for the opportunity to speak today. I also appreciate the presentations of our other speakers. For all of us, it's been many busy months and even years leading up to the new federal grants and the huge volume of work that they will create. Next slide, please. It is interesting that Sarah and I both started with similar slides related to definitions. Definitions are important when considering program data from various states. Different states and the federal government sometimes use the same terms in different ways. In Colorado, abandoned is not the same as orphaned. Abandoned means that the operator did not build the location or that all work at the location was properly completed. An orphaned well is not the same as an orphaned site, and not every orphaned site has an orphaned well. In some cases, work is limited to environmental remediation or surface reclamation, where wells were never drilled or they were previously plugged by the operator. On the other hand, we may have a multi-well pad with more than one well on the same site. Next slide, please. Our program staff manage and provide field observation of well plugging and flow line abandonment work with contractors. They monitor workflow, work quality, and budgets. We also coordinate with our finance staff and a central purchasing office for bid solicitations. And we have finance staff support to work with our central accounting office for contractor payment. Next slide, please. Projects are performed in phases. First, our field staff addresses site security, such as locks, tags, and fencing. They also implement stopgap measures such as leak repair. The next phase of work often involves well plugging and flow line abandonment. For equipment decommissioning, separators, tanks, and other equipment are removed for offsite salvage or disposal. Environmental work includes waste disposal, sampling, laboratory analysis, and remediation. Next slide, please. Finally, after other phases of work are complete, surface reclamation commences. Seeding, stormwater control, and weed control often takes monitoring and maintenance for multiple growing seasons before staff release the site for final reclamation. Program staff are responsible for design and implementation of all phases of work. Next slide, please. Part of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Act 3460-124 creates an oil and gas conservation and environmental response fund. It also allows for expenditures from the fund for work at orphaned wells and orphaned sites. Next slide, please. Colorado has a long history of oil and gas exploration and development dating back to the 1860s. The commission was established in 1951, and some of the earliest rules governed groundwater protection and plugging and abandonment of oil and gas wells. Many orphaned wells plugged by the program were drilled prior to 1951. Next slide, please. Prior to 1990, orphaned wells in Colorado were plugged using funds recovered from bond claims. In 1990, our legislature first authorized a budget appropriation to plug and abandon historic oil and gas wells without available financial assurance. Our budget line item for orphaned wells is funded by production on levy and penalty revenue. Bond claim funds are always used first when available before using appropriated funds or federal funds as we will move forward with the grants. This year, our commission passed new financial assurance rules to provide a more consistent funding stream through an annual well registration fee and increased bonding requirements, which will, in the long term, lessen our state's financial liability for orphaned well work. Next slide, please. Work includes coordination with our field inspection and enforcement staff for bond claims. We respond to and investigate orphaned well complaints alleging impacts to public health, safety, welfare, the environment, or wildlife resources. We also get some referrals from other agencies such as the State Land Board, which owns some land and some minerals where oil and gas is produced. And also from BLM, sometimes we will have a referral that might be on either private surface or private minerals, where the feds may have the other mineral state or the other state. Let's see. Our program staff evaluate eligibility for the program. We score orphan sites and assign a low, medium, or high rank based on multiple factors that are shown on this slide. Aerial photography, topographic maps, and our geographic information system are all helpful when evaluating factors related to the location of the site. These geospatial factors include population density, urbanization, location with a disproportionately impacted community, disturbance area, and the potential for erosion. Our staff review file information and perform field inspections to evaluate potential concerns related to age and condition of the well and the equipment, historic spills, active releases, and noxious or other undesirable weeds, and livestock or wildlife impacts. Our engineers review file information related to the well construction and the history of integrity management tests. Next slide, please. We have orphan sites in every major producing basin in the state. This clip from our interactive GIS shows planned sites that have no expenditures to date, in progress sites where work has commenced, but one or more of the tasks still remain, or completed sites that have passed final reclamation. We also show federal orphan sites as a map layer. Next slide, please. We have been fortunate in Colorado to have a legislature that has supported expanding our program during the last 5 years or so to address the needs of a growing backlog. We are again expanding our staff this year to meet the needs of the forthcoming federal grant program. We expect to have 13 full-time employees by the end of the summer. Next slide, please. As with our staff expansion, our program spending has increased, nearly reaching $5 million in fiscal year 2020, which in Colorado, our fiscal years end on June 30th. Expenditures declined the following fiscal year during the pandemic for a few reasons, including more limited cash flow from our mill levy and an unfilled staff vacancy. For this year, 2022, we expect to reach $5 million spending by June 30th. And on this slide, you can see 3/4 of fiscal year 22 are shown. Next slide, please. Our count of wells plugged showed a similar ramp up compared to the other charts for fiscal years 20 and 21. It is not shown here, but we are on track for our biggest year yet for wells plugged in fiscal year 22. Next slide, please. This chart illustrates how our reclamation progress tends to lag behind well plugging. That is in part because all of the work phases at the site often take several years to complete. And as we expand our staff this year, we plan to triple our reclamation staff from 1 to 3. On the next slide, you'll see that our backlogs have increased dramatically for fiscal year 22. And that's mostly related to several large bond claims. And you can see that in the upper right, that's a counter of the sites and wells in our backlog, both on fee lands and on federal or Indian lands. A few other things on our website. We've got an active list of projects and their status and some information on financial expenditures. And I think that's it for me. Thank you all for your time today. And I understand we'll be moving on to panel questions next.
Thank you very much, Dave. Very helpful to have an example of how this works on the ground in a state. We appreciate you joining us. So I want to thank all of our panelists and shift now to the final portion of today's webinar, which is our question and answer. We have 15 minutes left, so we should be able to get to a number of questions. They've already started to roll into the chat, so I'll encourage you to add questions to the chat if you have them. I also have a few questions that I can ask. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available to participants after we finish. The first question for our panel comes from Mitch, and he asked a question of Steve about federal prioritization. And Steve, Mitch's question was, how does the federal prioritization criteria interact with state level prioritization as it relates to grant funding? Does the federal prioritization supersede the states, or is there flexibility?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's really two completely different prioritizations. There's the federal prioritization that we have based on a number of factors, and we have gone through all of the federal wells, well, not all of them, but a good number of wells that we have information on, and assess them for methane leakage, health risks, proximity to environmental justice communities, and so on, and then assigned a score to each one of those so we could rank within, say, the Park Service or the Fish and Wildlife Service or BLM, sort of how those wells should be ranked for plugging. That will be different than the states, because the states can have their own prioritization method, and it's not influenced by what the federal prioritization method is. We certainly are recommending that some of these things get considered. Colorado is a great example of a state that already factors in a lot of these items that we also consider in our prioritization, but the two don't intersect. So, you know, the high priority federal wells might not be near the high priority state wells. But at the same time, if there is a group of high priority state wells that are getting plugged and those are close to low priority federal wells, we would still like the chance to coordinate and see if there's an opportunity for efficient contracting where you might as well get those low priority wells because you're already going to have a plugging crew out there in the vicinity, and you can take care of these wells for cheaper than mobilizing another crew at another time. So the states get to do their own prioritization, but yeah, we certainly still want to be coordinating on that.
Thanks, Steve. That's very helpful. And Mitch, thanks for the question. We also have a question, I think this can go to any of the folks on the panel, about the best thing that state legislators can do to ensure that their state oil and gas boards are maximizing their involvement in this opportunity. So I'll throw that open to any of the panelists. Do you have any advice for a state legislator who wants to make sure their state is well positioned to take advantage of this?
Yeah, I can jump in here. I would just say that, you know, your own state regulators are experts and they know this program inside out. Many of them have been with these state orphan well programs since their inception, and they will know what their needs are, what types of support are valuable to them, where resources should be deployed in the most effective, efficient manner. And so I would say, you know, if you have questions, access the experts you have in your states. I think also it's very useful. Peer-to-peer learning opportunities, state to state, I think are really valuable in these instances. You know, I'm just thinking in terms of prioritization as states are reevaluating their own sets of prioritization. Where can we share best practices, lessons learned, sort of have those dialogues at a state to state level.
Thanks, Sarah. Dave or Steve, you have thoughts?
Sure, I would agree with that. The program people are really the best as far as understanding what their needs are and how many employees, you know, they might need to get that accomplished. I would also suggest to make sure that the technical agency is coordinating with purchasing and payment agency if they're outside of that group, and it's helpful for I think legislators to look at the big picture and all agencies that are impacted, and we've already had that discussion with our governor's office and purchasing, just to make sure that we are ready to go to spend a lot more than we have in the past.
Thanks, Dave. And to Sarah's point about information sharing, Janet, I really appreciate the question. In order to sort of coordinate within state legislators, we are always happy at NCSL to connect you with your peers in other states. So if you have questions about getting connected with folks in other states, please do reach out to your NCSL contacts and we can try to help there. I'll ask one question and encourage our audience to add more questions to the chat. Each of our panelists noted the uncertainty about the number and location of unidentified orphan wells. We know that some states have unidentified or uncounted wells that are maybe very old or in a remote area for some reason didn't make it onto the most recent inventory. I'm curious, Dave, if you could speak a bit about how Colorado is addressing that problem, and then Sarah, maybe ask you later to add any information about how the other states are addressing that issue. So Dave, how is Colorado addressing the issue of uncounted or unidentified wells?
Well, in part, we're using the same methods that we've had for discovery for many years, and that is our field inspection staff. There's been several periods in the 90s and the early 2000s, and more recently when we had improvements in technology or even some of the equipment that our field inspectors use. We've expanded our field inspection staff, so we're more able to go out and at least look at some of the wells that we know that are out there, but maybe haven't been inspected in a very long time. So we do end up picking up some wells every year through that approach. We also get some incoming from complaints from landowners. Those would be more typical of the wells that we really don't know that existed, and all of a sudden one day in their cultivated field they end up seeing a pool of water. So that's an example. We've been contracting more recently with some drone companies that fly with magnetometers so that we can locate wells and flow lines. So that's been helpful in a more narrow landscape so far, but we expect to expand that type of investigation.
Thanks, Dave. Sarah, is there anything that you've heard in your work with other states that you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would say, some states are, again, using that drone technology coupled with GIS, as Dave mentioned. We're also doing other aerial plane mounted surveys. Some have sort of set up programs where they might have postdocs that go through their record keeping, their historical maps, and try to reconcile those coordinates, those land features that might appear on historic maps that aren't on modern maps, or vice versa. They're getting really creative. Some are working with citizen scientist groups who go on nature hikes, and as they go out in the field, they log wells that they come across. So I'd say there's a great number of different approaches. And I just wanted to highlight for everyone, the National Energy Technology Lab has one of these sort of pilots based around citizen science concept to help locate orphan wells. This is specifically in Pennsylvania, and they're using sort of methane emissions, drone measurement detection of methane emissions to then locate these wells. So I encourage everyone to check out that program.
Thanks, Sarah. And that's a Department of Energy program. So we appreciate you flagging that as a possibility. We've got a couple of things in the chat that I want to highlight. First, there's what looks like a comment from Kurt about the role of state appropriations for well plugging as important to serve as the matching portion of a matching grant. So we'll take that as a comment, Kurt. We appreciate you sharing that. And then there's a question about the best course of action to provide soil investigation remediation services for orphan wells. This is a question from Fiona about how is that being done? Is it being done by the state? Is it being put out to bid to contractors? Dave, maybe we'll start with you, and the other panelists can jump in if they have anything to add there.
Sure. We had a fairly big change to our site investigation and remediation rules in January of 2021. So as a result of that, with every well plugging and every facility decommissioning, we now have a environmental investigation work plan that goes along with it. So in response to that, we've had, I would say, probably an increased number in available environmental contractors that are supporting the industry and also us. over the last year or so, but that's how we handle it in Colorado. It's required by rule, so we have to get it done with the program with contractors.
Thanks, Dave. And thanks, Fiona, for that question. We've got another question for Dave about prioritization, and I want to bring that to you, Dave, in just a second. But I want to ask Steve a question first. Steve, you mentioned that federal funds can be used for capacity building, and what we're hearing from Dave and Sarah is that having state capacity is really important for them to be able to use these funds effectively. Can you speak a little bit more briefly about how the federal resources can be made available to help states ensure they're in a good position to use these federal resources?
Sure thing. Well, the small scale initial grants, the ones that go up to $5 million and don't have a deadline coming up, those have a very flexible use. Those can be used entirely to build a program up. And they're really designed for states that don't have an existing orphan well program to plug a lot of money into. So might need to, get one started up, maybe hire some consultants, contractors, whatever it is need to be done. And then there's a certain amount of the large scale grant and then of the formula grants that states can use for the additional capacity that they're going to need to run the program, to hire some new people, to get folks out there. So it's going to be in some cases, a state by state basis based on their needs. But we are happy to talk to states one-on-one and discuss like what's the need and how can we help you build out that capacity with the money that you're getting from this program.
That's great. Glad that resource will be available, and I encourage our friends and states to be thinking about how they can make use of those funds for capacity in addition to the funding for the work itself. Dave, we had a question from Janet about how Colorado uses its high, medium, and low rankings in your prioritization process, and she specifically asked whether sites ranked high will always rise to the top. Can you speak a little bit more about how you prioritize work?
Sure, that was actually a directive that came out of an executive order from our governor's office in 2018. So it required us to come up with a prioritization method, which we did, and lump essentially sites into a high, medium, or low category. So we defined that the first year that we went through that exercise, and the executive order also requires us to focus on the high and medium ranked sites before a low. Now we have the same type of situation that Steve mentioned with regard to interaction between state and federal, but we have the same issue that pops up just with our state locations, and that is we may be trying to target a high or group of medium sites in one area. But if there's other low-ranking sites around there, we do lump those in just for economy of scale and trying to, clean up one area while we have the contractor in there.
Great, thank you for sharing that. We just have 2 minutes left, so I'll ask one final question, and I'll direct this to Sarah first, but happy to have others jump in. We've heard a lot about the work that's going to be done, and Dave had some graphs showing how they're sort of scaling up their work in anticipation of that. How are states working to ensure there's a robust local workforce? Are you aware of sort of programs in states to make sure they have workforce available to meet these needs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's sort of two different workforces that we're talking about. One would be capacity within the state program itself. And the second would be the technical know-how, well services know-how to actually be in the field and properly plugging and abandoning these wells and taking care and remediating the sites. And I would say, there are examples from a host of states where, they've been simultaneously building up both sets of capacity and working both, with the advocacy community, the NGO community, researchers, and industry to make sure that they have the expertise both in-house, but then they also can rely on contractors and others in the field to actually have the bandwidth to close the wells that need to be closed. So it's interesting that states need to have both at their disposal, and I think that they are aware of that and are building their programs on those sort of two those two core pillars.
And if
Right there.
there's
Please
one thing
go
I
ahead,
could just add a quick plug for the EPA's Brownfield Job Training Grants Program that got $30 million in the infrastructure law, and the eligible uses for those grants align very nicely with the type of skills that you need to go out and plug orphan oil and gas wells. So certainly I encourage states to look at those as a possibility for building some capacity, mostly on the outside in the contractor community.
Great, thanks for sharing that. We are at 2 p.m., so I want to thank all of our presenters for their time and expertise. We greatly appreciate you sharing your expertise with our audience. And thanks, of course, to our attendees for participating. As a reminder, a recording of today's webinar and the presentation slides we made available on our website. Our next webinar in the NRI webinar series will be on April 21st, where we will explore state and utility efforts to increase energy resilience through the development of microgrids. To register or find out more information about that webinar, please visit ncsl.org or contact any of us at NCSL. Thank you for your continued interest and support of NCSL, and I'll ask you all to have a great day. Thank you.